Awesome. Thank you guys so much for having me. It's a great blessing to be here with you guys just to kind of give a bit more about this project. It's really important to me. It's actually one of my first publications I've ever done. So I'm really happy to kind of share this with you guys today. Um, but yeah, just a little bit about this first slide. We're talking about this publication, these great fossil tracks that we just recently got published and described from John Day fossil beds. Let's see if it's going to work for me here. There we go. All right. So just a brief introduction to myself. Hello, my name is Connor. I'm from southern Utah in a little town called St. George. It's right on the bottom uh, left corner of Utah, so it's like right close to both Arizona and Nevada. It's home to some amazing geology and actually quite a bit of paleontology on the rise as well, which is really great to be a part of. I got started at paleontology at a pretty young age. I actually got started as a volunteer tour guide and fossil preparator at 14. I started working with the NPS in a volunteer role when I was 15 doing some field work. And then I started my first research project at 16. And also my hobbies include lots of outside things like camping, hiking. But when, of course, the weather isn't great, I also do love movies and video games as well. So my education background, so I received my bachelor's degree in geoscience at Utah Tech University. It's a university here in southern Utah. And currently I am a master's student out at the University of Tennessee. I do a branch of paleontology, which involves trace fossils, and we'll talk a little bit more about what those are today. I don't know everyone's experience level with trace fossils, so we'll kind of go over that, especially where fossil tracks fit into that. But essentially, my thesis is looking at how we can use trace fossils and fossil tracks to kind of infer how terrestrial ecosystems and communities are responding to increases in aridification, which is pretty cool. So today, we'll kind of break down one of these internships I was a part of. It was a great program called The Scientist in Parks. It's an internship program which works directly with parks to allow early career professionals and college students to kind of get into park setting and then also do some really neat research, kind of experience the science as it's done in the parks. The one we'll be talking about today is, of course, this one from when I was out at John Day Fossil Beds. So let's go ahead and together kind of jump back to 2022 to take a look at this project. So just a brief overview of John Day Fossil Beds. I don't know how many of you folks have been out there, but it's kind of a little bit spread out. There are three different units. There's the Clarno unit, which is farthest north, the Painted Hills unit, and then, of course, the Sheeprock unit. And each of these units kind of hold some very unique and kind of different geology. The Clarno unit, of course, holds the Clarno Formation, which is Eocene. It's about 54 to 40 million years old. We have the Painted Hills unit, which has a section of the John Day Formation about 30 to 27 million years old. And then we have three formations, which actually occur in the Sheeprock unit. We've got the John Day Formation, the Maskell Formation, and also the Rattlesnake Formation. And then we've also got this great graphic here, just kind of showing where it is in accordance to the US. And we've also got our generalized strat column, which will kind of break down a little bit more as we get farther into the project. So just a kind of a brief overview. So fossil tracks are what's known as a type of trace fossil. So these are traces left by an organism as it was alive, as it's moving through or across a substrate. These traces are made during the life of an organism, essentially preserving that fossilized behavior. So fossil tracks are actually pretty common in some parts of North America. They're pretty common here in southern Utah, several places in Colorado. They're pretty common, especially Mesozoic stuff, things like dinosaur tracks. You get a lot of. And in some cases, fossil tracks can actually be the only evidence of a type of organism from a given time period, which we actually will find some of these fossil tracks from John Day are actually good examples of that. So here's just kind of a DEM, a model of one of these. And we'll kind of talk about those here in the next little bit, but I've got a lovely little dinosaur track here, just kind of showing a good example of a trace fossil. And then of course, trace fossils are not body fossils, right? And so they don't show us inherently the structure of an organism so much as those fossil behaviors. All right, so let's go ahead and kind of just touch on how fossil tracks are formed. And so a great process in which this can happen is an organism kind of steps into a wet substrate. The sun will dry and then harden this impression. And then over time, more sediment will fill in this impression. And after millions of years, this will become rock. And as the rock weathers out, we'll actually get two um, traces from it. We'll get not only the mold, which was where the dinosaur or whatever organism was walking along and made this impression. We'll also get all the sediment that filled in. It creates what's called a natural cast. And so a good thing to keep in mind is that the likelihood of body fossils being preserved, in almost all cases, is not very high, right? Not everything that has lived for a myriad of reasons has become a fossil. And the likelihood of fossil trackways being preserved in some cases can be even less. So how do we measure fossil trackways? So we take a couple different measurements just depending on how much information we have. If we have multiple tracks in a trackway or if we just have a singular track. Things like interdigital angles, which are the angles between the digits or the toes. We'll take measurements from those. If we have multiple tracks in a single trackway, then we can actually take things like stride and pace to actually figure out kind of how fast these organisms were moving when they made these traces. And then, of course, things like toe pad dimensions and then the orientations of the tracks. All these things kind of help us to kind of better understand and identify these tracks and the potential, what is called their ichnogenera, or essentially the names that we give these tracks to kind of keep track of them. All right. So now that we know a little bit about fossil tracks, we'll kind of get into the nitty-gritty of the geology of John Day fossil beds. So we've got our awesome geologic time, our stratigraphic column here. And so we've got four formations that are within John Day fossil beds. We've got the Clarno Formation, which is Eocene. We've got loads of different conglomerates, lahars, claystones, mudstones, and also interbedded shales. We have layered tuff beds and green-blue mudstone beds within the John Day Formation. The Maskell Formation has some of these tuff beds as well as having some fluvial and lacustrine sandstone beds and river conglomerates. And then also the Rattlesnake Formation, which is a bit newer. It's 8 to 5 million years old. It's just got kind of some matrix-rich conglomerates and also some gravel deposits as well. So this is a great picture of the Clarno Formation. These are what are called, I think, the Palisades out there in the Clarno unit. And this is a great example of one of those lahar deposits, a big chaotic event that transports really big material into this big, large deposit, essentially. And it's within these that we can also get these interbedded shales, which are really important for us finding these trace fossils, because we'll actually get almost all of them will be from these interbedded shales. Here we've got a good example of the, I don't know if you guys can see my laser pointer here. Can you guys see that okay? The laser pointer? Yeah, okay. So we've got some really great tuff beds that are kind of cutting through here, the very resistive beds, and then our kind of our mudstones and everything else is kind of all of these kind of badlands-esque little slopes that are in between them. We've got our Maskell Formation here, which looks a little bit similar to that. We've got our resistive beds kind of cutting through, and those are going to be where we'll probably find those trace fossils. None yet have been found from the Maskell Formation, and we'll kind of get into that as well. But all of these are going to be those mudstone layers, and then the resistive beds are going to be those tuffs and those sandstones. And then we've got our Rattlesnake Formation here, which, as you can see, there isn't much here to look at. There's mostly just these kind of gravel deposits and these conglomerate-rich layers, which are not conducive to trace fossils being preserved. All right, so now we'll go into kind of where we found the John Day tracks. So we have kind of two in each of these two formations. And so we've got two specimens collected from the Clarno Formation. So these are those shale deposits I kind of mentioned before. We've got a single trackway from a possible avian track maker, as well as three potential tracks from a lizard. We also have a trackway from a feliform organism from the Turtle Cove member of the John Day Formation, as well as two superimposed feliform tracks on the same block as a perissodactyl. We're thinking it's a tapir, but again, we'll kind of get into that as we get farther along. We haven't found any tracks in the Maskell Formation, and due to these kind of deep lacustrine deposits, it's potentially the case that it's too deep for any terrestrial organisms. We could get trace fossils from, say, different organisms, but no tracks have we found, and it's potentially because it's too deep for those critters to be making those tracks. All right. So something kind of integral to this project was the use of what's called photogrammetry. And so it's this process of taking images and uploading them to a software. And after we've done a bit of processing, we actually get these rendered 3D models, which are really helpful. We've got some great scale bars here. We've got our uncoded crosses, which is what the software will pick up on. And then we'll essentially just tell it how big the distance is here between the two uncoded crosses, and then that provides the rest of the scale for these models, which is pretty neat. There are two different types of models we used in this study. We used 3D mesh models, which is kind of like the industry standard. They're very helpful for viewing like the original color of these samples that we're taking models of. They're also very helpful for transferring between different software. A lot of different software use these, and we can also do things like 3D printing, animation if we wanted to have, say, an animation of a potential trace maker walking over the tracks if we wanted to do that. So it's very helpful. It's very useful for that respect. We've got a good example of one of those mesh models here. So we've got all the original color in the model, and then all these kind of like yellow lines here are our scale bars. So we've got our little flags here, and those are our little uncoded crosses, and then we just enter in that distance between them. Now, the other model we use, which is kind of my personal favorite, is what's called a digital elevation model, or a DEM. And these use separate colors to kind of visualize 3 dimensions in 2 dimensions. So the change in essentially topography of that surface is visualized through these different colors. It's especially useful for modeling these surfaces where we really need like fine-tuned resolution of these surface features. We've got a great example of one here. This is actually the bird tracks we'll be looking at here in a bit, but as you can see, these colors really do help to add to resolution of, these burrow marks and all these other little impressions that we have here. So it's a really great tool to help us kind of identify and fine-tune, identify these surface features in these, in some cases, very small samples. All right, so yeah, so photogrammetry is very useful for not only these reasons we've outlined, but also we can take measurements from away from the samples. So say if we had a really big block of sandstone that we couldn't bring into a museum, we could take a model of it, and then we'd be able to actually take remote measurements of it in the lab, which allows us to kind of gather our data outside of the field setting, which is really useful, especially if, say, this is a hard to get to site. All right, so just to recap, we know what fossil tracks are now, how fossil tracks form. We know kind of where they are in John Day fossil beds and kind of how photogrammetry kind of assists with that, which is really neat. So let's kind of get into the John Day tracks now, and let's kind of take a look at what they look like and what we've learned from them. So this is Joda 251. This is one of those from the Turtle Cove member of the John Day Formation. So this is, I believe, Oligocene in age. We've got two different areas we're going to look at here. So we've got this lower one with these two tracks. We'll just kind of refer to them as 251A and 251 1B. And then we also have the larger track here, these three impressions, which composes 251-2. So we'll kind of break those down. So as we can see here, we've got three separate impressions. We've kind of got this central impression, which is much larger than the other two. And then we have these other two kind of on the sides. One is a little bit larger than the other one, but they're mostly kind of parallel to each other, with this middle one just a little bit raised, a little bit more frontal to those other two impressions. We can see our scale here is about 1 centimeter, so it's not too small of a track. Pretty interesting. We've got our DEM here of that. And then, yep, this is what's from the AB tuff, so it's a specific layer of the Turtle Cove member. And the great thing about these tuffs is we can actually date the tuffs because they're essentially an igneous rock, and so we can take really accurate measurements in order to understand kind of how old it is. And so we have a pretty good understanding of how old this layer is, about 31.35 million years old. And we've also got all of our measurements that we could take off of this here. Since it's not a complete track, we can't inherently take the entire length of the track because we're assuming that these are probably toes of something. And so we could only get kind of the width. And then we've also got our angles and our toe pad measurements down here as well. So when looking at a potential track maker, obviously we have three impressions close together, so we'd assume that this would be something fundamentally that has three toes walking around at this time. And so there's only a few different things at this time that are walking around. We've got some early horses like Myohippus, and they do have functionally 3 digits. However, the middle one is very large compared to the other two, and also just be much smaller. The track of these things would be much smaller in comparison. And so we considered this for a second, but it probably wouldn't be the highest likelihood of being the potential track maker for this. We looked at some different old rhinos. Rhinos will kind of have these 3 impressions, but the majority of these tracks from these rhinos will also have a very large kind of pad of the foot to go along with it. And so that would be here toward the center. This is one that kind of corresponds the best to what we have in this case here in John Day fossil beds. But still, this likely wouldn't be the case just because it's also much larger. What we're thinking this is probably closest to is something like a tapir. And so something like this Protaporus has been found within these layers. We've found some composite specimens in Turtle Cove Unit H and also a partial upper molar in Unit D, which are associated with the AB tuff. They're pretty close to that same time span. And as you can see, this is a modern track from a modern tapir, and these digits are kind of aligning decently well to what we're seeing here in John Day fossil beds, kind of the orientation of that track, as well as that frontal placement of that middle digit just being a little bit above, having those other two pretty parallel to each other in the track. All right, so we'll go ahead and take a look now at these 2 tracks here. So it's a little hard to see. We've got a very well preserved track here with fundamentally, we've got our 4 digits and then kind of a pad down here. We've also got the remains of another track underneath it. You can kind of see it down in here, some of these digits that are left over. And so we've got essentially something that's walking around that's stepping onto the same tracks. So it's stepping onto the same, essentially the other foot. And so it's superimposing its tracks as it's going along. And this, of course, was on the same piece, so about the same time span. And then, of course, all of our other measurements as well. Moving on, we have some more kind of feliform tracks to take a look at. We've got one here and one up there. So we've got, again, superposition of these tracks. So whatever this track maker is, it's walking over the previous track. And so this is definitely a behavior of whatever this is that is creating these tracks. But as you can see here in the DEM, there's a bit better resolution on some of these digits. And so we've got the remains of a track down here, and then we've got our 4 digits of the next track that stepped over it with just a little bit of the center pad right here. And we can see it a lot better over here. We've got our 4 digits, our center pad, and then just a little bit of distortion on that other track that used to be there. All right, so we've got all of our measurements here of that and just another little bit closer in on these tracks of this potential feliform, essentially in the form of something similar to a felid. That's kind of what that means. All of our measurements just here over on the right. So in looking for a potential track maker for these, just due to the size and kind of the fact that all of these tracks, these feliform tracks kind of lack these, because to tell the difference between something that's more caniform or feliform, obviously canids or caniform organisms can retract their claws. And so when they're stepping, they have these very rounded digits. They don't have kind of a point up here where they have their nail striking into the substrate. And so this is kind of why we're leaning toward the feliform group. And so during this time, we had these little guys called Hoplophonius cerebralis. It's a nimravid or a false saber-tooth cat, and they're about the size of a modern bobcat. In comparison, we had a little bit of work here that we looked at the dimensions of these in comparison to other types of fossil tracks of felids of this time period. And so we can see that our sizes that we're seeing relative is about, we've got our group over here, which is about bobcat sized, and then we've got a group over here that's about mountain lion sized. And of course, our dimensions are of both of these examples of feliform tracks plotting very close to Filipeda paravula, which is also correspondent to that size range. And then when we take the interdigital angles, we're actually seeing those tracks plotting, again, very close to this kind of Filipeda genera of these ichnotypes, which is pretty cool. And so we can see, again, over here, plotting very close together with Filipeda paravula. And again, kind of closest over there in C over here. Okay, so moving on, we've got these tracks starting out in the Clarno Formation now. So this is Eocene in age. We'll take a look at these 3 tracks. We've kind of got a better track preserved over here with some kind of claw marks in an orientation all together here. So we've got 4 here with a 5th kind of down here. And then we've also got the remains of some tracks kind of going on up over here. It's a little hard to see in this one, but as we get closer with the DEM, you can actually see some of these kind of toe drags going on over here. We've got like claw drag marks going on, which is pretty interesting. Right there. So we've got all of our measurements over here. This is again from the Clarno Formation, so about 50 to 44 million years old. This is one of those interbedded shales we had kind of mentioned before from this location called Hansen's Bird Tracks, which is kind of alluding to the other stuff we're going to take a look at here in a second. But in looking at potential track makers, there's actually a very common organism nowadays, something that's lacertiform, so something close to things like true lizards. They're very common in forested and grassland habitats nowadays. Today they're found in Europe, Africa, Asia, just a bunch of places around the world today. As we can see, their back foot or their pes here kind of corresponds really well to this orientation of a foot that we've got going on here. And you can see that our toe claws would have kind of moved in that same motion, kind of dragging this way. And we see evidence of that, especially in this digit here, of kind of this dragging motion of this foot as it was walking along. So we've got a really cool locomotion trace going on here of potentially one of these really small lizards at that time. So lizard tracks are not common, but they have been found from the Eocene before. Um, the Green River Formation in Utah has held some. We've got a figure here from 1957. It's a little hard to see, but we've got some little lizard tracks going on and kind of what looks like a trackway going up this way. And we also have a better representation. This one isn't from the Eocene, it's from the Cretaceous, but we have just kind of that same orientation of that back foot in comparison to what we have from John Day fossil beds, kind of that same construction of a foot, a back foot. So pretty neat, pretty cool that we have this trace from a lizard, which is, not common and could also potentially be the first and only evidence of these small lizards in John Day fossil beds. All right, so this one's actually my favorite one. I'm super excited to talk about this. So we've got our two tracks over here, Joda 1536. So zooming in on these, we've got two tracks. We've got three toes here. We've got a very nice kind of toe claw impression here. And then we can see very well these kind of like ovoid structures here is actually where the toes meet the what's called the metatarsal. And so it's kind of the upper part of essentially a bird's leg, which kind of touches the feet, which is pretty neat. And we've got this very well preserved track here. We've got, in some cases, some toe pads left over from this track. And then we've got our second track here, which is a bit more piecemeal. It's not as complete. We've got those same kind of ovoid depressions from where the metatarsal meets the toes. And then we've just kind of got the tips of the toes kind of dipping into the substrate. And we've got that example over here in the DEM as well, or in the mesh. And then we've got the DEM here. And then we also have these very interesting kind of ovoid depressions really close to this second track, which we'll actually take a look at further here in just a second. So from the same locality, these bird tracks as well as the lizard tracks are from. So Eocene, about 50 to 44 million years from the Clarno Formation. We've got all of our measurements as much as we could get. Obviously, since we have a piecemeal track here, there's not as much information as we can get there from the better track here, but still a pretty neat trace. We have no webbing on these toes, which is pretty important in us trying to identify the types of track makers for these types of birds. We've only got 3 digits, which means that we don't have the back digit, the hallux impression moving back here. And then they're also very small, and their length in both of these cases, they're longer than they are wide, which is also very important for us trackers. So in comparison to these tracks to kind of our size ranges of other types of fossil tracks, we've got, kind of bigger things like storks up here. We've got webbed, kind of medium-sized birds over here, things like ducks. And then we've, of course, got our smaller, more shorebird kind of organisms, things like killdeer and plovers down here. And we can see that Joda 1536 is plotting very close to kind of that size range. And then when we compare interdigital angles, so those angles between the toes, we can also see that it's plotting very close to those examples as well. So all of our data is kind of pointing toward that sort of a group. All right, so we're thinking just based off of all of that, this is most likely something of a small shore deer or a small shorebird, something similar to a killdeer. So probably an ancient ancestor of those guys. We know of only a couple different birds from the Eocene that kind of match this size. We've got this one here from actually Oregon, the Lower Willow Creek Formation, which is pretty cool. So it's right about that size range. And then we've also got one about that size range from China as well, which is about Middle Eocene. So I've actually got this great video here. We're going to talk about this really neat feeding behavior that we have going on. So we've got this modern killdeer right here. It's kind of resting all of its weight on its back foot, and it's testing the substrate here with its next foot. And each time it tests the substrate, it's actually sticking its beak down into the substrate, looking for any types of food, any different worms or nematodes, anything like that. And I just love that he's just this adorable little guy going along, getting into all of the substrate, looking around for food. And so when we compare that to our trace here, we actually are seeing something very similar, very reminiscent of that behavior. We have a very well-preserved track back here, which is most likely coming from the bird resting all of its weight on this track, kind of, getting deeper into the substrate, allowing more of the track, more of the foot to become preserved in the track. And then we also have just kind of little elements of the second foot here, just kind of the toes and the back of the foot there. And we have all of these round impressions kind of in accordance to that. And we're believing that these are actually beak impressions going into the substrate, kind of in association with that foot entering the substrate, which is really, really cool. Not only do we have this feeding behavior, we also have numerous burrows going through here of potentially what this organism, this shorebird, this ancient shorebird was looking for. So we've got all of these little squiggly lines. They're a little hard to see in these figures, but all these little squiggly lines are what we call cochlichnus. It's a type of invert trace fossil. And so these little sine wave things going along are actually made from the trails of these little nematodes, these little worms going along through the substrate, which is pretty cool. So they're very common in shallow lacustrine environments. They can be found alongside other trackways. They've been known to be found in accordance with things like birds, but they've been around for a very long time, of course. These types of organisms have existed for a very long time, and so, of course, their traces have existed for just about that time as well. They're very common to be found near shoreline deposits where the water is meeting the shore. And so that, again, is more information kind of telling us that this environment that all of these organisms are inhabiting is most likely kind of along the shore of one of these ancient lakes back in the Eocene of Oregon. So just looking at our results we've got here, we've got 12 different models that we made over the course of this project. We had the 6 digital elevation models and then also the 6 corresponding mesh models. We had our feliform tracks, which were pretty significant. They were the most abundant tracks that we were able to identify from the samples we had. They're similar in size and orientation to this previously identified type of fossil track, Filipeta paravula, and they correspond decently well to, things like the nimravids we have at that time. So it's kind of fitting very well together with the body fossil record that we have. As well, we have our avian tracks, which were very interesting, similar in size and orientation to kind of this Avipeda thrinax, this different type of fossil track that's been identified previously. We also know that this is probably the only evidence of avian organisms from the Clarno Formation in John Day fossil beds, which is really, really cool that we can include this very diverse type of organism here at John Day fossil beds. And also, of course, preserves those nematode traces in accordance to this feeding behavior. We've got our perissodactyl track, which is potentially something like a tapir. And if it is a tapir, of course, then that would be one of only 7 specimens of fossils from a tapir from the entirety of John Day fossil beds, which would be really cool. And we also have these lizard tracks, which are the only evidence of these small lacertiform lizards being a part of these ecosystems in the Klarno Formation. So lots of really great information we can learn from these fossil tracks, even though they are of course very small in comparison to some of the body fossils. So just a brief discussion on these. We've got our tracks identifying these cool paleo environments, especially in the Klarno Formation. We're seeing shorebirds, lizards, inverts, all contributing to this kind of shallow lacustrine environment. It's all kind of suggestive of that environment, and the geology also works with that as well. This very fine-grained, laminated shale is something that, you would expect to get preserved from these kind of very calm, shallow lake environments. We've got all of our different traces that are kind of also contributing to this feeding behavior, which is really neat. And of course, we've got that faunal diversity increasing. We've got all that information. We can now learn that these lizards and these avian track makers are interacting with the substrate and with these ecosystems, whereas before we didn't have that information, which is really neat. And of course, we only have these tracks from the entirety of the John Day fossil beds from all the work that we've done. And so since we only have these tracks, it's not enough for us to be able to kind of suggest between, hey, should we name these new types of fossil tracks? Or should we include them in the other types of fossil tracks that we've already identified in the literature? There just really isn't enough information based off of solely these few tracks in order to do that. But it does provide some really interesting info for us learning about this kind of increase in fauna at this time, and also this really neat way to learn about the paleo environment. So why study tracks? So fossil tracks and trackways are, of course, we've been able to identify behaviors of organisms as they were living. These Klarno tracks are roughly, 50 million years old, and it's really neat to kind of identify this, this feeding behavior that's still very prevalent in modern shorebirds. So, this is a feeding behavior that has existed for, 50 million years. And so we know that this is a very successful behavior for these organisms in these environments. We're able to provide that information on those types of environments as well. We're able to identify that, hey, this is probably an ancient shoreline based off of the traces we're seeing and the geology of the samples that we have received. It's also enhancing our understanding of our species diversity. We're able to include those lizards and those birds within our understanding of those ecosystems. And also, of course, they work alongside our body fossil record to kind of help understand, what's going on, how are these organisms interacting with their ecosystems, and what types of organisms we're seeing in these areas. The body fossils of things like small lizards and small birds are very fragile, and it's only under certain conditions, that you can get those to preserve very well. So having these traces is really a key in helping us to understand, these more smaller organisms and their effects on these ancient ecosystems. All right, so just a brief acknowledgements. I'd love to thank everybody from John Day Fossil Beds for their assistance. Nick Famoso, Chris, Jennifer, all the paleo staff that were there that summer. They were really helpful for this project, very influential in kind of keeping this internship alive, which was really great. Dr. Dan Hembry, who is actually my advisor now at the University of Tennessee, for his assistance in the countless drafts of this publication, as well as the many organizations, Scientists in Parks, GSA, the National Park Service for contributing to the internship, as well as Conservation Legacy, AmeriCorps, and Stewards Individual Placement Program. And of course, other NPS staff, Jack Wood, Tina Vader, for getting us the software we needed for this project. And also, I would love to thank the Cenozoic vertebrate track makers of the Clarno and John Day Formation for leaving a great impression on this project. All right, thank you guys so much.
Did you hear the applause? I just turned the mic on.
Oh, perfect.
Did you hear the applause?
I did, yes, thank you.
I was trying to time it so it didn't have any feedback. Great.
No, that's awesome.
Questions?
Yeah, Harold Hines here.
Yes.
I'm online. I've worked both of these sites where you found material, although many, many years ago. This material has got to be incredibly rare. No, I mean, start out vertebrates in the Kleiner Formation, except for the new mammal bed, are just incredibly rare.
Mm.
A long time before any vertebrate fossils were found in terms of dating, the nut bed area, for example.
Mm.
So how are these collected and what kind of frequency are we talking about here? Were you actually looking for these or were they already in the collection and you sort of discovered they were there? Tell us more about the whole process.
No, for sure. I wish that we actually were able to identify more um, fossil tracks while we were out there. Unfortunately, I didn't find any fossil tracks while I was out there. All of these fossil tracks were already in collections. They had been sitting in there, some of them since like the 70s, I think. And it had just essentially been that nobody wanted to look at them because we had so many big, cool body fossils in John Day fossil beds that it really was just like, hey, no one really wants to work with these. No one really understands what's going on with these. And so it was really cool because when I applied to the internship program, I had done work with dinosaur tracks using kind of these same methodologies, things using photogrammetry. And so I was looking into internships and I'm like, hey, it looks like you guys have fossil tracks. It'd be really cool to work with them. So that's kind of how this all went down. So they were definitely already identified. We tried to get out, and every chance that I could, I was looking for fossil tracks in all of our field work. I think every week we had 1 day of field work during that summer, and I was there for like 3 months. So we really tried to find stuff, but as you have pointed out, finding things like this is also very difficult. Yeah.
I that question was, I was asking how you went about finding them. Are they on the surface? Do you know how they were found, the stuff that's in the collection? Was it just a trackway on the surface like a dinosaur trackway, or was it something that was split out of a block?
Yeah, so Nick also attached this he was one of my advisors for this. He's actually a paleontologist there. But yeah, the Clarno tracks were collected in the late 80s, and we don't have great field notes from any of the fossil tracks that they collected. And the other ones were donated in the mid 1970s. Um, so we don't have great information on how they were collected. We also really tried to go back to the locations, but we don't have great locality information for them as well. And so it was a little bit of detective work trying to figure out, where these were coming from. Essentially, it had to do with, for the John Day tracks specifically in the John Day Formation, we had to kind of take a backwards way of looking into the AB Tough and finding kind of similar features in the AB Tough, and that kind of helped us to connect to that. And then we found these more interbedded shales. We didn't find more tracks in them, but very similar shales we were finding in the Clarno. And so that's kind of how we were able to kind of narrow them down that way. But I don't know if they were found either as float material or kind of, as you say, were they found in a surface that someone kind of noticed. The Clarno tracks are fairly small. They're only about that big. So I would assume that they might have just been float pieces that someone had collected.
Great. Thanks for the
Yeah.
answer to that. Okay, Kara, hang on a second.
You're good.
There you go.
Hi, it was a great presentation. Thank you.
Sure.
I had a question about how do you know the difference between a young animal versus a fully adult animal? Maybe the footprints were something young and not grown up yet that was like those feline ones. Maybe
Hmm.
they were like a baby saber-toothed tiger kind of thingy. How do you know the difference?
So that's a great question. In a lot of cases, we we don't know. There's really not an easy way to identify that. In a lot of cases as well, we'll look at things like to take the dinosaur track example. There are, especially what I'm looking at now with my master's degree, there are two different types of like three-toed theropod dinosaur tracks, and one of them is smaller, one of them is bigger, and the whole one of the whole premises of the project is looking to figure out since we have these very closely related, but one is bigger, one is smaller, it is open to debate that maybe they're the same thing. One is smaller and one is bigger, sort of a thing. So it's really, we don't have enough information just from the tracks themselves to be able to identify if it's a juvenile or if it's an adult.
All right. I noticed the chat was flashing there and I looked and Nick's actually with us tonight.
Yes,
Oh,
yes.
welcome, Nick. Nice to see you online there. He had made a comment there in case you guys can't read it. The Clarno tracks were collected in the late 1980s and the Turtle Cove tracks were collected in the mid 1970s and were donated to the park in 77. He thinks the Clarno tracks were split rocks when they were looking for leaves.
Mm.
All right, another message. Anybody else online with a question? Oh, there's a hi. Hi, Nick. Yeah, that's very, very cool. So glad to have you with us. Other questions? None here. All right, you have 17 people in attendance live, and then online, I think 2 or 3 of those are us. So at least 12. Yeah, I'm gonna stop the recording. Where does it appear?
Just check out. He's gone.
I don't know. I don't know, but there's a couple of chats left. Oh, Lisa. Yes. All right. Yeah, I can't do that.
Did he give you
Request permission to record.
Oh, it looks like Lisa has another question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So she said, I might have missed it. Are the specimens in your presentation on display anywhere? Yes, actually. So I think it's either 251 or 283, one of those from the John Day Formation. It's the trackway of the Felid trackway, where there's 4 of them going along. Those are on display at the visitor center there in John Day Fossil Beds, which is pretty cool. I think they made a brand new display for trace fossils after this came out. I think Nick will have to um, comment to let me know on that as well. But yeah, I believe it's still there. So if you were to go visit, you should be able to see those that are there.
Hey, Connor. Yeah, it's actually the Feliform tracks have been on display for 20 years.
Oh,
Um,
great.
so those have been out there the whole time. And we put the grasshopper eggs out. We didn't put any of the other tracks out yet. Mostly because like I love those bird tracks, but it'd be really hard to display them in a way that people would actually be able to figure out what we're looking at. Um, but yeah, the other specimens that Connor looked at are still back in collections. They haven't been brought out for display yet.
Thanks for sharing that. Yeah, Connor, when you get a chance, if you share it back with me, I can't stop the recording. Any other questions? Any other questions for Nick while he's there? There we go.
I think I gave that back.
Yep, I just got it. And
Perfect.
stop recording.